helping. It is my extreme pleasure to introduce a really good friend of mine, Naomi Moneypenny, and she's going to be talking about what's new with Project Cortex. So thank you very much, Naomi, for your time, and I'll let you take it away.
Thanks so much, Rick. Definitely appreciate it. And thank you folks for listening in wherever you are. It's great to be part of this community event. It's something that I've been very passionate about and worked with Rick with in the past as well. But also just for many years as an MVP before I joined Microsoft. And so welcome to the best community on earth, as far as I'm concerned, from a technology perspective. So you all have made great career decisions to be part of Microsoft 365 and to think about the ways that you can learn from all of the great expertise and sharing that we have inside of the community. So thank you for being part of it. Thank you for being a part of this event. And thank you so much for having me to come and talk a little bit about Project Cortex. So I'm going to talk through just a few things in terms of where we're going a little bit with Project Cortex. I do want to make sure, obviously, we've got a bunch of events coming up. The Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference. Previously, the SharePoint Conference is now expanding its whole platform to think about Microsoft 365. And so we hope that next year we'll be able to join you live and in person for that event. And then, of course, thank you so much, as this is a community event, to the sponsors too. So definitely appreciated for their time and attention and generosity in making this event real. So if I haven't met you before, hello, it's great to be here. My name is Naomi Moneypenny. I have the privilege of leading director of Project Cortex. I lead all of the product development for the area. And so I'm part of the OneDrive and SharePoint team, but in fact, my team goes much further than that across the whole of Microsoft 365 to deliver some amazing new experiences in what we do with Project Cortex. Now, we've had a keynote earlier as part of the event in terms of Project Cortex and sort of giving you an overview of the functionality and some of the things that we were looking at. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of this time to really go through some of the content understanding areas, because that's the part where you can really think about some of the capabilities we have already inside of Microsoft 365 and how we're helping to extend a lot of those capabilities as part of this. And so I wanted to go through just a few experiences to help with that. And so as we go through, Rick's going to monitor some of the questions that we have as part of this. And he's going to help me with just understanding a little bit more in terms of, you know, where we're going with everything that we talk about with Cortex, but also how you can help connect it to the work that you're doing right now as part of your everyday organizational work. Okay, so there's a few things that I want to sort of showcase. First off, just a little framing. I won't linger on this because we covered some of this in the keynote, but the experiences that you use every day inside of Microsoft 365, that personalization, that driven from, you know, things that you might be using inside of Office applications, the work you do inside of Outlook, everything you do in Teams, you think about, you know, publishing documents, modifying documents, everything that we do inside of SharePoint, even things in terms of Windows, where you're logging in every day, your Azure Active Directory, organizational structure, all of that great stuff is really part of the Microsoft Graph. And so when you think about the content that we're creating every single day inside of SharePoint and other applications, oftentimes, you know, SharePoint is the backend storage, obviously, for those things. So if you're in Microsoft Teams or if you're inside of Yammer, you're storing content behind the scenes inside of SharePoint. And then if you're familiar with some of the newest things that we've announced recently with the Microsoft Fluid framework, with the Fluid framework is actually being stored behind the scenes as well inside of SharePoint. So all of that content, all of that richness effectively is part of the Microsoft Graph. And so the signals and the edges that we get from the Microsoft Graph are an incredible richness. There's billions and billions of signals, literally, not to be too Carl Sagan about it, but it's pretty amazing. Just the incredible depth of understanding of a specific organization that's within that Microsoft Graph. And then if you're familiar with some of the Graph APIs that we have already, you know that you can access a lot of that information through graph.microsoft.com, and you can see some of the endpoints and develop further applications on top of it. Well, what we really did with the Microsoft Graph is to think about how can we help with knowledge in this area. And so that's where Project Cortex was really born from. We have incredible richness of information, but there's still so much more that we can do to help connect in more and more content, whether that's through the Microsoft Search Graph connectors, or whether we can think about bringing in external data sources from other areas, as well as other parts of Microsoft 365, for example, things like Stream, and being able to use some of that information in new and different ways. And so really what we're doing with Project Cortex, if you think about it, is building on top of the Microsoft Graph, and we're really creating a whole new indexing essentially for knowledge inside of your organization. So previously the nodes, those little white dots on this particular chart here, those nodes are things like files and people and meetings and tasks. You can think about what we're doing with Project Cortex essentially is creating new dynamic nodes within the Microsoft Graph that are centered around topics inside of your organization, and really how that information is coming together to dynamically populate things around topic pages and topic cards. And then the other area around this is really around insights. And so there's insights in terms of how we deliver the content itself, and how we help to recommend articles and suggest things to you proactively within Microsoft 365. But there's also a whole set of insights that we can deliver in terms of how you understand content and how you're able to extract what you need as part of it. And so when you think about Project Cortex, is really thinking about, the information that's coming inside of your organization. So for example, if I'm working every single day, maybe I'm a project manager, I get a bunch of proposals, I get a bunch of deliverables maybe from external consultants that I'm working with. Maybe I'm, in accounts payable or something like that, and I've got a bunch of things like invoices, purchase orders, bills of lading, all kinds of stuff that come into my organization. Or maybe I'm in HR and I have things like employment forms and other information that's coming in. And I need to be able to extract that information from those business processes as it's coming in, because it makes me more productive as an individual. The other sort of part of this with Project Cortex is that I do that extraction and I think about the metadata that's coming in, but I also want that to contribute, of course, to the knowledge network that I'm building inside of my company. And so that's where that relationship with the Microsoft Graph becomes so critical, because I can help you to, make the job that you're doing right now more productive from extracting that information as it comes into your business processes. But it's always over time adding to your knowledge network. And so it's part of that richness that we have inside of the Microsoft Graph, and then being able to create knowledge from that information as well. So it's just a very important thing in thinking about, as Project Cortex evolves here, you have a lot of things around that business process and how you think about the centers for business process, and then thinking also about how knowledge is being extracted dynamically from that information. I wanted to spend a couple minutes just to go through from an architectural perspective what we do a little bit with Project Cortex, and this helps to inform some of the things that we're doing as well for future directions. The first thing I wanted to draw your attention to is at the bottom of this chart here, we talk about those content connectors. We recently did a great session at Microsoft Build, and I'm happy to connect you to all if you haven't seen it already. But it helps to understand a little bit with how the Microsoft Graph content connectors are bringing in information and then using that as kind of the way to process that inside of Project Cortex. And so our friends over in the Microsoft Search world, which is a world I worked in for a long time before I came onto Project Cortex, looking at how Microsoft Search uses those Microsoft Graph content connectors, so things like Salesforce, ServiceNow, MediaWiki, Windows file shares. If you have a bunch of what I call dark matter inside of your organization, and you're going through and figuring out whether these files are useful or not. Using the Microsoft Search connectors is a great way to basically use that information, to find that information, use it inside of your graph connected experiences. And then as part of that, Project Cortex can actually then use that information as well. So we'll be able to do kind of knowledge indexing essentially on top of that information too. So a key step from all of this is to think about those content connectors and the richness that they bring. Many customers ask us about, how do I bring in information from things like ServiceNow and Salesforce? And that is the primary way that you'll bring in information into Project Cortex that's coming in from other sources outside of Microsoft 365. Our goal, of course, though, with Project Cortex, I don't want to understate our ambition there, is to really think about all of the information you have inside of your organization, the whole data estate, as Satya calls it, and really how we can help to process that information too. So that's great. Once you've brought that information in, you think about, the Microsoft Graph content connectors. We're also then, of course, using the data that's inside of Microsoft 365. So in this case, specifically in SharePoint, as I mentioned, SharePoint is the backer for not just the experiences you use directly through SharePoint, but also through Teams for file storage. Think about Yammer for all the file storage there as well. And then over time, it's more and more of those new experiences, things like Fluid, etc., that are coming through as well. And so Microsoft 365, including those security and compliance pieces. So for example, if you've already got content that's marked as highly sensitive, if you've used any of the Microsoft information protection areas already to sort of mark your and classify your data, those things are being obeyed essentially inside of Project Cortex as well. And so that's kind of a great way to bring in that data and think about the different experiences. Let's move on to talk about just a little bit about the intelligence features and then some of the areas that we do specifically in the content understanding area. So first thing is, we're going to talk about managed metadata, and that's a huge service that's been around for a long time inside of SharePoint. So if you've been with us for a long time, since maybe SharePoint 2010, and you're very familiar with the managed metadata service, you'll be delighted to see some of the improvements that we've made. We've already started rolling out the new modern experience. So if you haven't checked that out, it should be out there for your organizations already. And then, of course, we've made great improvements as well with Microsoft Search. And so the Microsoft Search inside of SharePoint, you should have already seen the search box that's come up into the central suite nav as well. So that also is rolled out. And so that's a great sort of set of capabilities, if you will, that we get to build and improve upon as part of what we're doing with Project Cortex. We're also doing a lot of work in terms of understanding the intelligence that's coming in as you upload files directly into SharePoint and into OneDrive. So for example, within Microsoft Search, we always had this capability, for example, of if you've uploaded a receipt, we do a bunch of work behind the scenes there to figure out like this is a picture of a receipt and to do some extraction based on that information. We're kind of supercharging that capability, if you will, inside of Project Cortex and using a lot of the Azure Computer Vision capabilities directly in here as well. So that it helps you to understand the images that you're uploading and thinking about how you can do handwriting extraction, text extraction essentially from there, tagging automatically, all of those pieces as well. And I think it's just an important set of trying to make it smart out of the box. And then, as I mentioned, from a content understanding area, and this is where we'll spend most of this presentation on, a little bit about how end users themselves are processing content. So creating a destination here, we've got some new and novel methods for how that information gets processed and brought into your organization. So I just wanted to sort of share that from an architecture perspective. I think it's just very important how all of this information is coming in, how it's flowing inside of your organization, and that we're helping to integrate a lot of these experiences too. And then our goal is to have these capabilities be across Microsoft 365, right? So we're going to talk about and show SharePoint in these experiences, but the same thing will be true inside of Teams, Outlook, etc., wherever it's appropriate, obviously, to surface up this functionality. Now, I'm going to spend some time talking through content understanding because we spent a lot of time in the keynote sort of talking through the knowledge experiences, but I wanted to spend a little bit of time to go deeper on the content understanding area specifically. And this is really because it's around that ingestion of information that you have every single day and thinking about how you're recognizing and extracting and processing that information. And so organizationally wise, I think a lot of customers and maybe you yourselves will spend time as maybe a project manager, as I mentioned, maybe you're working on a specific flow inside of your organization. You want to have a more effective way to basically process all of that information that's coming in. And so this is really that rich set of capabilities in here. Now, within the context of what we do with Microsoft 365 here, within Project Cortex, you can really think about, you're connecting that people to knowledge. We're going to talk about content processing. There's also sort of the content compliance area, and that's a great rich set of capabilities we have within Microsoft information protection. And again, all of that is obeyed essentially. Things like sensitivity labels, encryption, all of that stuff is being used as part of Project Cortex as well. So a whole set of great capabilities. And I know there's been good content during this virtual marathon to cover that as well. And then just at the bottom here, I want to sort of underlie again these capabilities around the graph, Microsoft APIs, and the AI technologies we have there. And then kind of this idea around taxonomy, the managed metadata services and enterprise content types. there is still a great piece of information around information architecture and how that balances with AI inside of your organizations. And so there's this continuous balance, right? I think about people and AI, giving it enough schema and enough architecture around your content. There is no substitute for doing that. So as much AI capabilities as we're bringing, and we're bringing a tremendous amount of work with Project Cortex to life in terms of applying the latest and greatest methods in machine learning. But I think in my mind, like from a substitution perspective, there is no substitution for information architecture. And so building on the key capabilities that we have inside of SharePoint for the managed metadata services and making sure that enterprise content types are used in your company as well. So I've got a sort of remit here that helps to understand a little bit about how we're automatically classifying this content, and some thinking about that process and how you're actually managing that content more holistically, and then using things like security and compliance labels. Much of our customer conversations that I have every day, people are always asking me about, well, if I've already marked this content as sensitive, is it already marked as highly confidential inside of my organization? Does Cortex know about this? Can we use this? All of those things definitely are included in the way that we think about Project Cortex and scanning that information. The other piece of this, of course, is that managed metadata experience has evolved, and so we'll talk through some of those capabilities now. And then, being able to leverage all of the Power Automate goodness. I know there's been several sessions as well on Power Automate and how you can use approval processes and all the richness that brings as well. Really thinking about how you can supercharge, again, the experiences you have. Once you've extracted that metadata, then you can use Power Automate to run on top of this as well. And so this is a great example here, just a screenshot here to help with this. So we're doing some simple things like conditional formatting. So for example, if I've got a bunch of trade confirmation notices here, we've extracted that information automatically from those trade notices. It's a pretty simple process to be able to do that. You'll notice in this case that all of those columns here are helping with that. And then you'll see we've got conditional formatting. And of course, as part of this, I could then, trigger a workflow on here as well, so that I can say, for example, if I was extracting the customer name or the amount or something, if the amount was over, $70 or whatever, I could flag that in the system and send it for an approval process. And so, really thinking holistically about all of these capabilities together is a really rich way of experiencing these information. So, we talked a little bit about this from a discovery and curation perspective, and then, how that information is being brought in as well from other systems outside of Microsoft 365. So definitely all in vision for what we're doing. So let's talk a little bit about these different ways for content understanding specifically. And so, there's a few areas here that we want to walk through. So document understanding is something that we call machine teaching as kind of the method. And this is really about extracting information from people's heads and codifying it inside of an AI model. And so if you've ever wondered like how you can do that, I think this is the big sort of area that makes me so excited here, because it's really about processing unstructured information. And the cool thing here is that, a little investment in time, I do realize that, so to build one of these AI models, but it means that the folks inside of your organization, the business process and subject matter experts can really build what they need. And so, for example, if I take, the example of a project manager, you've sent out, a request for proposal out to a whole bunch of folks. You want to be able to extract what you need from that request from proposal. For example, proposals coming back, they're coming from lots of different vendors, right? They're all sending it in very different formats. They have different structures to the document. It's a really hard problem for machine learning to solve. And so instead of just doing, brute force kind of text analytics here, we want it so that, the project manager can teach what's important to them. Maybe it's like the deliverables and the milestones. We want your procurement expert to be able to teach what's important to them, which is, probably the deliverables together with the amount of money it's costing for the deliverables. And then you've got folks like maybe your legal, and contracting people who would be, teaching what's important in terms of terms and conditions that's within that document as well. And so, thinking about how you take that information and use it is incredibly valuable. Now, behind the scenes, both in the document understanding side and then the forms processing side, I do want to mention that we are using enterprise content types. And so this is something that a lot of folks don't realize, as we're creating these different models, is that, in fact, behind the scenes, we're creating an enterprise content type, and it's a very rich and flexible structure from that perspective. So I can actually have essentially an AI model that is coupled together with an enterprise content type, and it's a really cool basis for much of the innovation that we'll have in the future. Now, just a quick thing onto form processing, and we'll get into this a little bit more. Form processing is really around structured information, so things that are very templated, if you will, and so using that to extract what you need, and then extract that metadata, and then again, applying Power Automate, etc. on top of it too. And then object detection, which is really around Azure Computer Vision, essentially using a lot of that computer vision capability natively inside of Microsoft 365 to figure out the information that's already been put in there. So a couple of things just on document understanding here. We've got some great, sort of new improvements, especially since we just showed them from November of last year. There's a lot of great improvements that we've done on top of here. And so you're thinking about, they're using these kind of advanced types of learning essentially here that allow you to both extract what you need from the person's knowledge, but then also think about the different patterns of how people explain things. And this is always really interesting to me because I think about, the way that you teach a person is very different than how you teach a machine usually. And so using that same kind of way that same model that we use with people. So for example, if I was explaining something to Rick, I would be saying, hey, Rick, you do this and this and this, and it's because of this reason. So for example, I might say, within my project proposal information, it's like, well, I'm looking for, this set of deliverables with this kind of time frame, and this time frame needs to happen between these particular dates, and I need to see that the sequence of those things is happening in the right way. And I always kind of give it that explanation, right? That's the way we teach to other people. Usually with machines, we do some very brute force kind of learning here, but in fact with people we do explanations, and those explanations are incredibly valuable. And so one of the things that we do with this document understanding capability is you're basically building up a library essentially of explanations, right? You have them for your AI model here, but we're also looking at how we can make those more generalizable inside of your organization. And so the goal here is that I can teach the machine about how to deal with information in this particular business process. But wouldn't it be awesome if I could take that model and apply it to another document library that has, similar files, and then I can just modify the explanations for that. And so that's one of the big areas that we've invested a lot of time in to understand how we can apply that across the different models and be able to use that information and that model in better ways across your organization. The wonderful thing here is that, part of the value proposition we have, obviously, with Project Cortex is how much we're crowdsourcing the knowledge, if you will, inside of your organization. And so in this case, we're helping to encode knowledge of people, even if it's things like, processing proposals or processing, business agreements that are coming in. We're helping to encode knowledge, not just inside of content, but inside of AI models that can get reused inside of your company. And so, if you take a minute to really think about what that means about encoding knowledge, not just in content and documents and chats, which is what we usually do. If you take it one step further and help to encode it inside of models, that gives us a basis for incredible innovation for the future. And that's really one of the big areas that we've invested into. So let's talk a little bit about form processing here. And so this is where we're going off and leveraging that connection to AI Builder, which is part of the Power Platform. And it's a fantastic set of capabilities here. So the wonderful thing is, the same way that we're reusing a lot of different integration points and APIs that are available, AI Builder is also bringing a new set of experiences as well, and bringing an easy way basically for you to use that information, whether it's inside of the Power Platform or whether it's inside of Microsoft 365 and SharePoint. So the sort of native integration here that we have, so I've got a little, I showed a little demo in the keynote of this, but just to show, on the document libraries themselves, you already have that option for Power Automate. You're going to see that option for AI Builder specifically here. And then you'll be able to go off and say, create a form processing model in this case. We're going to take you to a more integrated experience with the AI Builder. And within AI Builder, you basically can upload 5 or so different examples of the documents that you want to process. And then you're going to go through and essentially do that identification of what fields you want to extract. Now, I showed in the keynote a little bit about the sort of supervised and unsupervised part of this, and so I think it's worth just taking a minute to think about that. If you're familiar with machine learning, there's two kind of supervised models and unsupervised models. Unsupervised models are basically the ones that do their work out of the box. It's a complete black box to you, essentially, and that work is just being processed. If it finds a match, it does. If it doesn't find a match, it doesn't work. Supervised is essentially where you've done that kind of training before, but it helps, a human helps to guide it, essentially. And so when I showed in the keynote that demo in terms of, some of the fields are found automatically, things like date and purchase order numbers, they're very simple fields you'd expect to find. And then other fields which are more like, the specific line items on a purchase order, for example, is something that's a supervised learning. And I get to basically allocate, as part of that process, I get to allocate what those fields are called. Now, behind the scenes, we do that. You go through, you say, I'm going to take date and I'm going to take purchase order, and I take these bounding boxes and put them on those line items. Behind the scenes, I'm creating an enterprise content type, right? So when I'm specifying those columns, I'm specifying the columns of a content type. I'm specifying the metadata that I want extracted as part of that. And that's how we bring that inside of SharePoint, right? When we show that extraction, we've done that metadata extraction, essentially you're populating all of those columns behind the scenes as well. And so I think it's just an important tie-in to understand these AI models that you're building are building enterprise content types. And you get some advanced options here in terms of, you can see on the form processing area here on that little drop down where it says, create a new content type or reuse an existing content type. And so it's a very powerful mechanism, again, to think about, how we're investing both in content types themselves, things you can create as an admin or as a setup, but also how AI models themselves are content types and things that you can reuse inside of your organization. Okay, let's talk a little bit about metadata and some of the great pieces that we have here. So in terms of the metadata foundation, this is something I've been very passionate about for a long time. I know it was one of the cool things when we first started Project Cortex. It was a really interesting discussion. I will just share that with our leadership when, hey, we're going to work on this new awesome set of innovation inside of Microsoft 365. And one of the first things I signed up for was, let me take this 10-year-old service and modernize it. Right? And so with the managed metadata service, something we've invested a great deal in. And I really do think it's an incredibly foundational experience. And so, again, if you haven't looked at it, if it's new for you, spend some time to think about, managed metadata and how you might use it inside of your organization, because it is something that we see going across Microsoft 365. And we also think about the extensibility models that we will have for it in the future as well. So a few things, coherence across Microsoft 365. We want you to be able to use the same terms, the same topics, essentially across everywhere in Microsoft 365. So whether I'm in Teams or I'm in Yammer and I'm Outlook, I'm in Word, I'm in SharePoint, I should be able to have access to that same set of metadata. And we also want to think about, consistent tagging experiences. So thinking about end user controls, many of the consumer habits we all have on Twitter, for example, of hashtagging stuff, you should be able to do, a similar type of action, appropriate, of course, within the business and enterprise environment. But we want to think about, a great way to give you a set of metadata that helps you to enrich the information you need as part of your document and content creation process. And then, of course, as part of this, we wouldn't think about enterprise content based on terms, right? And so as you're navigating some of these newer experiences, we want to give you a great way to have navigation that's helping you to figure out like the filtering, the refining as part of this, and then being able to use that information very easily as an end user. Right now, it's kind of hard, right? So it's difficult to find some of that information. You may have tagged it, it still doesn't show up as well as it should in some of those areas. And so we're making some great improvements there as well. And then the last piece is really about enterprise content types. You've already heard me talk about that, but it's again, a whole construct around this, really using this as kind of an idea for your organization more generally. And so we're making it a lot easier to be able to both syndicate those appropriately and then use them in lots of different ways, as I said, as the basis for AI models as well inside of your organization. So that enforcement and consistency is definitely a big piece of this too. So, a couple things that we've done already. You should be seeing that modern experience for the Managed Metadata service. Let me know if you're not, but it should have rolled out almost essentially across everywhere worldwide at this point. And that is just the first step, right? We're modernizing what you already have inside of the suite so that it's a new modern experience. Don't worry, the same capabilities are there, so we haven't moved or changed anything. I just want to be clear about that. We haven't sort of, deprecated any functionality that was in Classic and it isn't in Modern anymore. I just want to show that. We have some movements in terms of making things easier on the page. So, for example, when you go to a term page, a specific thing, you can actually see like all the translations of the different languages there. You can use machine translation as part of that. We think it makes it easier to manage. So if you don't at first, if you're familiar with Classic and then you go to the modern experience, you think, oh no, Microsoft's moved something. We haven't. It's just moved it somewhere on the page. We haven't gotten rid of it, right? So it's there. And you do have the option to go back to the Classic experience as well. So I just wanted to reiterate that, because if at any time, for whatever reason, you feel like you want to go back to Classic, you can, and it's easily to do. The same thing is true here on the content type piece. So we've done a lot of modern admin experiences here, and we're bringing lots and lots of information as part of this too, and then updating some of those end user controls as I mentioned. So for example, being able to filter here by the category and seeing that kind of tree structure really helps an end user. It makes it a lot simpler to navigate and find the information that you already have, especially when you have a whole bunch of files within your organization there too. And then just on the couple of new capabilities that we have. And so term store analytics is one of the big areas. Analytics generally, I think, is one of those huge areas that people want more and more information on. And it's definitely something we want to encourage as well. So we're going to do some reporting. This isn't available yet. It's something that's coming later on this summer. So you will see some of the term store analytics capabilities coming in to help you understand like how are terms being used inside of your organization, and then things, suggested actions around things like terms without synonyms. So that's a big area as well. And then we're doing a bunch of improvements in terms of importing and exporting terms as well. So if you're familiar with MMS right now, Managed Metadata Services right now in taxonomy, you already have the ability to import terms that are in a CSV set. We'll be using a new import method, which is the SCOS method. So SCOS is a structured knowledge object stores that we have. So it's an industry-wide capability. And so it's a file format that makes it basically a lot easier to import the kinds of taxonomies that you want as well. So thinking about that simple knowledge object as well. So that's this sort of SCOS format is I think a great improvement, and we will again be doing more and more on this as well. And let me know your thoughts about this as we go through. The other sort of big area really is around content type syndication, and so making this easier to syndicate this information from the perspective of just the replication that needs to happen, the push mechanism as well. And so we're going to be structuring this a lot more around hub sites, and hopefully you're already very familiar with hub sites. If you're not, please spend some time to get up to speed with them and the principles of information architecture that we have inside of SharePoint. So for example, we want to do intelligent syndication, right? Not just push every kind of content type to every site, but instead say, hey, these are the kinds of content types we have for legal. We want to push them to the legal hub site, or we want to push them to the finance hub site, etc. Make sure that we're doing intelligent syndication here, and then custom content types as part of this, and then being able to enforce those content types being used on new libraries as well. So definitely a key area too. Just a couple things that I want to sort of wrap on this particular section with. You'll do some extension here, so you'll get a bunch of experiences around the Content Center template that we have inside of Project Cortex. We showed a lot of that in the keynote, and then you'll be able to build your own models essentially for kind of unstructured documents and then for structured forms. And then you have a bunch of capabilities that will come online in terms of extensibility, because I often get these questions of like, okay, well, that's great. That's new end user value. That's fantastic. How do I build on top of it, right? Maybe you're an ISV, maybe you're a developer within your organization. You want to be able to extend these experiences. So the first thing is, looking at workflows and customization of those workflows with Power Automate. If you're not familiar with Power Automate, I'd really spend some time again learning about those new capabilities. They have a great set of capabilities even within the RPA area, so the robotic process automation area as well. And so that UI flows that you can do in terms of, taking very manual processes right now. Like if you've got folks who are doing what I keep hearing of called swivel computing, and that's when you swivel from one monitor to the other monitor because you're just basically transposing data from one system into another system, right? There's some great capabilities there. And if you think about using those kind of UI flows, for example, and then attaching it to a business process that maybe your incoming information like processing agreements or purchase orders, and you're using Project Cortex for doing that, then you can run approval workflows and other workflows on top of that. And so think about this very holistically of like how you're building this out for your specific scenario. And then the extensibility that we have both with the Power Automate platform and then of course, with the graph set of APIs as well with Microsoft 365. The other sort of big thing that's coming as part of this is the taxonomy APIs. And so previously we had CSOM APIs that were available as part of taxonomy. We announced just last week a new set of capabilities that we will have as part of the Microsoft Graph. And so we will have a set of taxonomy APIs available later this summer. And so we will be able to showcase, how you interact with terms, how you manage term store, term sets, term groups, and terms themselves, and doing CRUD operations across all of that as well. And then the final area here was really around SharePoint site design. So things like content centers are actually just new site designs. And so you should be able to think about, the different ways you want to use those inside of your organization. Again, this is another capability. It's already part of Microsoft 365. If you're not familiar with it, now's a great time to be able to get up to speed with it. Because once, we start invoking a lot of these pieces as part of Project Cortex, the site design structure is a great way to be able to extensively deliver what your users need as well. I put in a link here to the sort of very preview documentation that we have in case folks are interested in the taxonomy graph APIs. This has some very simple, it's very pre-release documentation, so don't go off and build a whole bunch of live site stuff based on this, but it's just to give you a preview of this. Once we have the real documentation, I say real documentation, but the sort of preview bits available for you all, it will of course go through the developer experiences that we have, developer.microsoft.graph in this case, and then it'll be available obviously through the graph.microsoft.com preview endpoints as well. But it's just a good place to be able to just go check out like what are these endpoints going to look like, just thinking about that again as you build applications in your head as well. So just the extensibility timeline that I wanted to share here as well, because I know I covered a lot of different pieces, but from from a developer and thinking about your line of business, both from an ISV perspective, as well as thinking about this from a developer timeline inside of your organization. Whole bunch of capabilities that are available now. If you haven't seen some of the content, either from the virtual marathon, but also from Build last week, you should check that out. Please do go look at the patterns and practices area if you're not familiar with that at m365developer.com. And then, the Microsoft Search set of capabilities that we have as well. For example, building out custom search pages, doing custom redirection of the search box, of the search query. Essentially, it's coming into that Microsoft search box that's up in the center of your suite navigation now. And then using capabilities like Form Recognizer, Computer Vision, Power Automate, those pieces too. Now with Project Cortex specifically, we have a bunch of these capabilities coming. So taxonomy APIs, those will be the first things that come out. We'll also have content APIs too. And then we will have a rich set of graph controls around topics themselves, so things that are being knowledge that's being indexed inside of your organization. And then we'll also have a rich set of component controls too. So all of that from an extensibility timeline is on its way as well. So let's just spend just a couple minutes here just on the sort of knowledge network capabilities. I've shown sort of demo as part of the keynote, so I won't go through all of those. I don't want to rehash that in this section, but I do want to sort of draw your attention again to thinking about the Microsoft Graph content connectors that I mentioned at the beginning. When you're looking at content that's outside of Microsoft 365, the primary way to do that will be to bring it in through the Microsoft Graph content connectors. There's a bunch of information that's out there from other events as well, but the primary URL, if you're not familiar, is aka.ms. It's also known as Microsoft, so aka.ms, and then /IWantConnectors. And so if you haven't read the preview documentation, that's a great place to do it. So think about ServiceNow, think about Salesforce, MediaWiki, Windows file shares, Azure Data Lake version 2, all of those great capabilities that we want to bring in this information. Now, of course, that empowers you as well to go out and build your own connectors. We have several great partners like BA Insight, Raytheon, and Accenture who've already built connectors who will be available as part of the Microsoft Graph content connectors, but you can also build connectors yourself. And so if you're thinking about this knowledge area and like, how do I bring this information in from, maybe I've got line of business systems, maybe it's something that's pretty obscure that that nobody else has built a connector for, yet that's a great place to be able to do it. So, thinking about this holistically as you prepare for Project Cortex and that information and knowledge getting indexed inside of your organization, that's definitely a rich place of this as well. Okay, so let me transition, just talk about a couple of other experiences. You may be thinking about, a little bit about how does this all work, behind the scenes, and then how do I help to set this up as well as part of Project Cortex. So I wanted to sort of cover some of those experiences here as well, to help just understand like some of the ways that we'll be able to bring all of those pieces together. Now, the first thing I sort of talk through is just a little bit around, how you think about those setup experiences that we have right now. And so there's a bunch of admin controls that are coming through, and those admin controls enable you basically to say, what do you want as part of your sort of mining, or your mining, in this case, your knowledge indexing is probably a better way to walk through it. But thinking about the sources of information that you'll have and how you're using that inside of your organization. So the first thing is within the Microsoft Admin Center, you will see a new sort of pane come up as part of that. And so within there, you'll see knowledge and search, and those settings are together. And then you'll see within there administration controls that allow you to scope out what it is you want to index inside of your company from a knowledge perspective. So, for example, picking specific sites within your organization, as well as specific areas where you want capabilities like the document understanding and the form processing information to come through as well. So you have complete control on how this gets used. I just want to be very clear about that. You have complete control about, how the information, what information is being indexed, and then you also have complete control of where you're applying that as well, and then who gets to see that information as well. So there's pretty critical there. You can also then, of course, be able to specify within the content understanding area, like where the sites are that you want to see those things like create form processing model or creating content centers, which is where you do the document understanding, the machine teaching modeling right now. You have, again, administration controls around creating those, as well as, putting security groups on those particular sites so that you have control over all of that. It's very important to us as we've built out Project Cortex. We've been working with customers for many months now, that you feel control of the system, that you build trust with the system around it, and then you have the ability within your organization to roll out this very extensive set of capabilities in a very measured way that fits for your company. We recognize like there's a lot of areas here where some parts of your organization might want to go further and faster. Others may only care about for example doing content understanding, and then there'll be other parts of your company that say no, I don't want to use this at all until we're really ready. And so it's very important for us to make sure that you have extensive controls on this. I've just put the roadmap up here as part of this too. You'll be able to get more information, obviously, as part of the GA that we have planned, and you'll be able to get more information also at this link here. With that, I'm going to pause and see if we have some questions, Rick.
Yes, we do have some questions. First question is if there is a connector for Dynamics 365.
Great question. So I haven't actually seen one of those, but I'll check. With the Microsoft connectors that we have right now, the connectors team has been very busy building connectors to systems that are not Microsoft systems, if that makes sense. And I know Dynamics is one of those systems that we're already having lots of conversations with in-house. So don't know that there's one right now, but I'm sure there will be.
Very cool. Also, another question talking about when you spoke about processing documents coming from different vendors that may be coming in different formats. Am I right in understanding that the sample documents that you teach the AI model don't have to be the same?
Correct. That's exactly right. So that's one of the great benefits of using this document understanding, that machine teaching approach. Because it's really easy with structured documents like a form, right? You can put, 5 examples together very simply. The whole purpose of using this kind of small data problem, which is what this is in machine learning, how do I help to use the information that's coming in to help train the system in an effective way? And so the cool part here is that when you get those very unstructured documents and they're very different from each other, that you can train the model based on that, and you're able to help it to flexibly understand and build explanations as to what it's looking for in the future.
So cool. And then so the second part of the question is, if you upload 5 documents, each from a different vendor, and each is in different formats, and the model can still learn which pieces of information to take. And then do I need more than 5 documents, or is it because after you teach it that vendor 1 document, page 1 has vendor name, and then vendor 2, so on and so forth, goes to page 5?
Okay, let me just sort of hold there for just a second. So, okay, I was not as clear as I should have been, so I apologize for that. So we have 2 methods for doing content understanding, right? One is the form processing, and that connects off to AI Builder, and that's for structured documents like forms. And then we have this other method, which is natively included inside of SharePoint, which is this machine teaching document understanding area. With form processing, because it's a structured document, that's where you have to give it 5 examples, right? You have to give it 5 basically examples of the template and then teach it what you want from there. In this other area where you're doing document understanding and machine teaching, there it's not about the amount of samples that you have. There it's actually about you showing and teaching the machine examples of what you're looking for. And so you don't have to have a minimum of 5, you'll have to have some obviously to do that, but it's not the same way as a kind of a templated method. It's much more around, is this an example of the document or isn't it? So I can actually label the document and say, here's a proposal, and here's a document that's completely unrelated, and say these 2 things are not the same. I can actually teach it like a positive example and a negative example, and then within the positive examples of those documents, what are the things that I'm looking for inside of there, and you can go through and write those explanations for it. And so it's a different method there, different way of using it.
And in regards to content understanding, does the model allow to learn from TIFF-based PDFs?
Yeah, so TIFFs are a tricky one for us right now. If the TIFF is something where it can be digitally rendered, and I mean from that like in a PDF file where you can actually copy and paste the text, then we can use that. If it's completely image based right now and it's just truly is TIFF formatted from that perspective, just image, that's difficult for us to process. And so the solution I would have, a mitigation in the meantime for that while we're working on that problem, is to go use the great capabilities we have in Azure for computer vision that can actually process information out of things like TIFF files and then be able to sort of dump that text out essentially from it and use it that way.
And are there any plans to retire the content type hub, or are we going to keep it for consistency?
Yes, we'll keep it there. So no plans on that perspective. We're just trying to make it intelligent, faster, and better. You
have the functionality to it, right? And then I think that's it. Jeff Willinger says hello.
Hello. Hey, Jeff.
And that's all the, well, hold on, I think we got one more. No, we've got all the questions.
All right, cool. I hope this was a useful session for you all. I know I went a bit in depth, but that's the whole point of doing these kind of sessions, right? Is to spend a bit more time and getting a bit more granular on these different areas. And I'm incredibly excited about Project Cortex. I hope you all are in our community as well. I'm thrilled to bring this set of capability to you all, and I really can't wait to see how you all both adopt it and then build on top of it, which is really amazing.